Okay, so before I begin, I just want to say a couple of big thank yous. First of all, to the organisers of the conference, Simon Zagorski-Thomas, IASPM UK and Ireland, and everyone at University of West London who's been involved in making this such a great online event. I'd also like to say thank you to Nick Pryor at the University of Edinburgh. He is the co-author of an article from which this paper is taken, and we're hoping it's going to be published next year. But yeah, really appreciate any comments or questions you might have that will help us improve the paper and the article. Okay, so in the academic field of popular music studies, scholars interested in diagnosing the changing state and fate of popular music have been drawn towards democratisation as a way of making sense of wholesale transformations in how music is made and by whom, together with industry-level shifts such as the growth of the independent DIY movement, stylistic diversification, and a widening of the social composition of fans and audiences. Whole genres such as skiffle, punk, post-punk, and dance music have been characterised as democratic as a result of what some authors argue to be widening participation among non-specialist producers, while processes of democratisation are often specified as a corollary to, if not driven by, the advent of new technologies. Hence, Andrew Goodwin argues that the availability of cheap recording gear in the 1980s, from sequencers and drum machines to electronic keyboards and samplers, broadened the very concepts of musician and music. At an organisational level, David Hesmondhalgh refers to the explosion of small independent record companies in Britain since the dance boom of the late 1980s, as a direct challenge to the structural dominance of multinational corporations. Here, democratisation refers to the decentralisation of the industry and the rise of a plural network of clubs, shops, and small-scale record companies. Indeed, for Hesmondhalgh, dance music represents a kind of intervention in the politics of distribution and production, partly because of the DIY appropriation of relatively inexpensive digital technology. Over the last 2 decades, the widespread availability of virtual studio technologies, music-making apps, and games consoles has given these arguments additional impetus. Here, cultural democratisation is part of a larger set of transformative conditions related to the advent of speedy, late capitalist, high-tech conditions that have further blurred boundaries between amateur and professional, producer and consumer, fan and critic. Hence, for Alan Durant, the advent of relatively cheap, digitally based musical instruments and processes such as sequencing and multi-tracking not only ushered in new modes of music making, but also a restructuring of musical literacies and a spreading of technical knowledge beyond the domain of the studio-based professional. DIY, it follows, reflects a new mode of production, where cultural hierarchies are redrawn and a new openness to a flatter, more open and inclusive field of popular music has emerged. Add to this the advent of widely accessible, user-friendly digital audio workstations like GarageBand, peer-to-peer software, and the affordances of the MP3 file, and one is left with the impression that something like a technology-led wave of democratization in music production, distribution, and consumption has profoundly leveled the playing field, reaching its apotheosis, perhaps even terminus, with the so-called digital age. While not simply dismissing them as lacking analytic or diagnostic power, this paper sounds out a cautionary note for popular music scholars looking to employ terms like democracy and democratisation. I will argue that such terms lack precision, often fusing together a number of messy and poorly understood processes that need to be disentangled in empirical settings, and which raise a number of questions related to cost, education, know-how, and access that are irreducible to mere technological availability. These processes are, in turn, inseparable from broader social structures, hierarchies, and inequalities, not least in terms of who is making music and in what kinds of social conditions. In short, we need to treat these terms with suspicion and subject them to critical scrutiny. So, at the beginning of his 2001 book, Strange Sounds, Timothy Taylor suggests that the advent of digital technology in the early 1980s marks the beginning of what may be the most fundamental change in the history of Western music since the invention of music notation in the 9th century. Digitization for Taylor, as for many commentators over the last 2 decades, represents nothing short of a watershed moment in how music is produced, stored, and consumed. Just as the era of the fluid, non-degradable, perfect digital copy has undermined the ability of a centralized industry to control music content, a shift in power to the network consumer that was to reach its zenith with Napster, so what gets made and by whom has been opened up with the advent of software studios, virtual studio technologies, and internet protocols. The digital age from this perspective has intensified and accelerated processes of democratization, leading not just to a further flattening of hierarchies in culture at large, for instance between high and low culture, but to a rapid dissolution of prohibitive barriers to making music and participating in music cultures. Capturing the essence of this latest phase of democratic cultural production is, for Ritzer and Jurgensen, one that requires a change in terminology. The advent of user-generated content, or what was once termed Web 2.0, has undermined hard distinctions between production and consumption, given rise to what the authors call prosumer capitalism. The whole economic system, in other words, has been transformed to cater for the generation of increasingly abundant, free content among increasingly active publics. Seemingly mundane digital practices such as liking, tagging, composing playlists, generating mashups, tweeting live sets, uploading lyrics, writing live reviews, contributing to internet forums, and so on, are part of a hugely kinetic system of demotic creativity, according to this view. Indeed, for Jenkins et al., the shift to digital circulation signals a movement toward a more participatory model of culture, in which the public does not simply consume pre-packaged messages, but actively shapes, shares, remixes, and reframes media content. And while there is certainly debate over whether this constitutes anything more than the generation of endless free labor and content for the new platform capitalists, Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, many argue that digital media, nevertheless, bring about a generalized opening up of creative practices and a reimagining of cultural and political participation. As far as music making is concerned, a key component of this shift concerns access to and ownership of the tools of cultural production. Here, it is argued, the era of the professional, high-value physical studio and its expensive instruments has been usurped by the rise of software studios and associated digital devices like laptops and more recently gaming consoles and smartphones. Critics and scholars have written in optimistic, even utopian terms about the availability of cheap digital audio workstations, games, and apps that have reconfigured the kinds of expertise needed to compose, mix, and master songs. thereby reducing barriers to music making among wider communities. It's no longer necessary for musicians to hire out expensive recording studios, rely on orthodox channels of music distribution, or require the backing of a major label. Instead, the new amateurs, accompanied by their powerful tools of digital composition and connection, are empowered to compose in their bedrooms or on the move, to collaborate with diverse others, and to bypass an increasingly outmoded music industry in order to disseminate their music. Or, as Ryan and Hughes put it is clear that what has occurred is a phenomenal democratization of recorded music production, as the mainstream commercial music industry is not so much replaced as circumvented by thousands of musicians. While it is certainly true that, as Savage notes, the advent of software studios like GarageBand, which is shipped free as part of Apple's operating system and comprises a relatively simple and stripped-down interface with a library of loops, potentially puts tools of enormous compositional power in the hands of producers, it does not necessarily follow either that it is technology that drives creativity, nor that participatory social and musical practices have reached a democratic endpoint. Technologies are always embedded and do nothing in isolation from social processes and patterns. Still, it would be short-sighted not to recognise how emergent music-making communities, particularly those located in poor and disadvantaged urban neighbourhoods, have successfully appropriated these tools and twisted them in practice. When Dylan Mills, aka Dizzy Rascal, won the Mercury Prize with his debut album, Boy in the Corner, in 2003, he said in his acceptance speech, "I come from the PlayStation generation, making music and beats on anything we can." Mills was a member of Roll Deep Crew, one of many collectives that had been forming across London, particularly in areas of the East End like Bow, Poplar and Limehouse. One of the ways in which its young producers were making what became known as grime was with the Software Music 2000 that came with the Sony PlayStation. The following year, journalists were proclaiming a major shift in cultural production, using the discourse of revolutionary change and technological democratisation. In The Independent, Kevin Braddock wrote, "A fundamental shift is occurring in British music culture, and it's not just the way music is being made that's changing, so too are the people making it. It's a sound coming from the imaginations of the first generation to have grown up surrounded by digital technology, from gaming consoles and computers to mobile phones, CD burners and MP3 players. Today, any teenager with a few pounds and a good idea can become a star from their own bedroom. Technology has made it possible to compose and record a song on a standard PC or a Sony PlayStation gaming console, burn the track onto a rewritable CD, pass it to a DJ, and hear it played on a pirate radio station within hours. A process that would until recently have taken months can now be achieved in a day." It wasn't just Sony PlayStation's Music 2000 that grime producers were using to make beats. They were also using Fruity Loops, Cubase, Mario Paint, and second-hand PCs donated by Morgan Stanley in nearby Canary Wharf. As Dan Hancock points out, it was more than the availability of music software on gaming consoles that laid the social foundations for the development of grime. He shows how the role of the state in the form of his participation in and exclusion from secondary school education was integral to Mills's learning of how to program music using Cubase and PCs. Youth clubs were essential spaces where aspiring grime DJs and MCs met to play music and rave together. Moreover, many grime MCs and DJs, like Richard Cowie, aka Wiley, were the children and grandchildren of West Indian families with experience of making reggae music, cutting dub plates, and performing with sound systems. In other words, tacit knowledges related to a feel for certain kinds of music were an important factor in how grime musicians had been socialised in the family and taken up and developed in new neighbourhood collectives and groupings. What I want to emphasise then are the continuities in the social structures that made the making of grime music possible. The sharing of knowledge about how to use programs like Cubase occurs through the mentoring of more experienced adults like Mills's music teacher Tim Smith, and the influence of his engineer manager Nick Cage, who owned a recording studio in Bermondsey, southeast London. Cage introduced him to using Pro Tools in what Mills calls a proper studio. In this case, the DIY democracy of making music in bedrooms, home studios, or classrooms with Cubase, Music 2000, or GarageBand is the initial stage in a process that involves learning how to use more professional recording technologies and working in studios funded by the budgets of independent and major record labels. On the one hand, then, grime might be celebrated as a democratized form of music making that makes it possible for any teenager to become a professional musician. In this sense, it represents the idealized convergence of digital technology and participatory culture. On the other hand, the accessibility, ownership, and use of sound recording technologies like Fruity Loops, Cubase, and GarageBand, which have contributed to the development of a genre like grime, are embedded in a series of social and family relationships where music making is part of the cultural life of participants. This includes relationships related to trenchant disparities between and within social groups within the geographical areas of London associated with grime. Indeed, we should not lose sight of the social inequalities that continue to shape and disrupt urban life in UK cities like London. The riots that took place in August 2011 being an example of civil unrest and protest where issues of racism, poverty, and police violence were understood to be reasons for the resulting crime and disorder. Clearly, there also continues to be systematic social, cultural, and economic barriers to cultural production and consumption as well, including those related to gender. While key figures in the early history of grime were women, journalists Chantal Fiddy and Hattie Collins, for example, female grime artists such as Lady Leisure and Nadia Rose are less well known than their male counterparts, reflecting wider trends in the music industries. In other words, grime is a genre that has been and continues to be dominated by men in spaces such as pirate radio and music videos, where hypermasculinity is performed and reproduced. Recent academic research by Georgina Bourne and Kyle Devine has highlighted the class and gender inequalities that exist in music technology courses that are now part of higher education in the UK, alerting us to the importance of recognising the continuing alignment of technology with masculinity. This is another reason why it is important for researchers to develop a more critical attitude towards the idea of any kind of digital democratisation. In concluding, I want to draw upon the work of an academic who shares my scepticism about the idea of digital technologies being part of a linear process towards greater democratisation. Rasmus Kleis Nielsen, in his entry on democracy in digital keywords, an updated version of Raymond Williams's conceptual dictionary, states, "It is not clear that the widespread use of digital technologies means that they have played the kind of revolutionary role in actually existing democratic and democratizing political practices that have sometimes been forecast." The reasons for this, he argues, is that many other forces have shaped democracy more than has the spread of relatively affordable and accessible digital technologies. My argument has been that the term democratisation is too readily leveraged as a catch-all term, connoting a generalised opening up and flattening of cultural hierarchies, often as a result of technological developments or decreasing cost. What these narratives gloss over are the often contingent processes to do with the way musicians engage with and appropriate music technologies in often uneven and sociologically fissured contexts. In the case of music software packages used in the making of Grime, dislocating democratization implies moving beyond the term as an all-inclusive process that strips out the complexity of music making in social settings. At best, we might recognize pseudo-democratic tendencies at work in the take-up of music technologies, and in this paper I have hinted at how this might be done, by detailed descriptions of music making in practice. But even here, we need to fill in the relatively empty and often linear and romantic idea of what these terms mean and ensure we are asked more probing questions about their use in popular music studies. For while the superimposition of overtly political and economic conceptualizations of democratization onto histories of popular music is tempting, it should be avoided. The former often carry assumptions around participation, i.e. voting, rational action, costing, and an economistic behaviours, i.e. buying, that only superficially get at the uneven, non-linear, and thick modes of practice that characterise cultural production, including music making. If the term is to be used at all, I suggest divesting it of its liberal Western democratic connotations, where the tendency is to convey intractable, perhaps even natural processes of opening up, smoothing out, and levelling. Instead, it is incumbent on popular music scholars to draw out the complexities, contingencies, and irregularities of musical engagements as they unfold in everyday settings, and to build up a vivid picture of the entangled nature of bodies and music-making devices within constraining and enabling social contexts. Here, music technologies are far from inert objects waiting to be purchased, deployed, and disseminated in a mode of common instrumentality or technique. Their development, take-up, and appropriation are, to return to Raymond Williams, shaped by the complex social relations of the worlds into which they enter. Thank you so much for listening. I'd really appreciate any feedback on the paper or any questions anyone may have, and I really look forward to trying to answer them online. Thanks.